Good morning, everyone. All right, let's dig in. I think we're on session 10, although I'm not sure about that. We're looking at Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. So why don't you open up your Bibles? Let's begin at Mark chapter 1, verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they, that is the four who are following Jesus at this time, went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people, remember, we're in the city of Capernaum. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look after him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let's go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Now this is really several pericopes, and there's much in these verses, in these 10 verses, that we've already talked about. We've talked about the healings and the demons, and we're going to dig into those deeper in the chapters to come. So at this point, I'm not going to dig too deep into this material. So this will be kind of a short session together. It'll also be a little bit different because this will be the last session I record for several weeks. My brother-in-law Earl and I are going on a canoe camping adventure in the Allagash waterway, so it'll be a couple weeks before we get back to this. And so I kind of want to wrap it up a little bit with a little bit different discussion. We've talked about the demons, we've talked about the healing, we've talked about the sick, we've talked about the call to preach the good news. But as I say, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to think about Peter. The great 19th century Bible scholar Brooke Foss Westcott says this of the Gospel of Mark. In substance and style and treatment, the Gospel of Mark is essentially a transcript from life. He might have added a transcript from the life of the Apostle Peter. What I want you to understand this morning is this, that you need to see Peter's, fingerprints on this gospel. That this gospel is a transcript not only of the life of Jesus, but it is a transcript, if I can maybe mix my metaphors a little bit, seen through the eyes of a particular man, Peter the Apostle. As early as the 2nd century AD, as we mentioned earlier, Justin the Martyr titled this gospel, The Memoirs of Peter. Now there's certainly in the Gospels later theological additions to the narrations from Peter and from Mark. For example, verse 34, and Jesus healed many various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Now, Peter didn't know that at that particular moment. He didn't know that Jesus was silencing the demons. He didn't know that, but he knew it later on. That's what I mean by later theological narration. But you also understand, you have to recognize when you read this gospel how vivid it is. And it's vivid because it's vivid in Peter's mind. There is so much in this gospel that reeks of Peter's memories of Jesus. For example, just the text we just finished reading, as soon as they left the synagogue. That's a memory. Peter's thinking to himself, right after we left the synagogue, we went home, and there we found my mother-in-law sick with the fever. Or a little bit later in I forget what verse it is, but further down the pericope, where it says, in our English translation, it says, very early in the morning. In the Greek, it says, a great while before day. It's almost as if Peter is remembering how he had to get up at 2 a.m. to go look for Jesus. That's sorts of very specific memories. For another example would be Peter and the others find Jesus and they say to him, everyone is looking for you. That's a memory. I remember when we found Jesus and we had to look for him because he was in it says a solitary place in the English. In the Greek, it says a wilderness place. He had found this isolated wilderness spot right in the middle of civilization just outside the city of Capernaum. And there they found him in the dark. And when they found him, they were kind of annoyed. And they said, hey, everybody's looking for you. And then mystery of mysteries, Jesus says, hey, we're leaving. We're going somewhere else. We're not staying here. That narrative is made so vivid because it's the memories of Peter. It's not something he heard about. It's not something somebody told him about. It's something he experienced. So how does the Gospel of Mark depict Peter? If the Gospel is Peter's memories, which we believe, then it's fair to ask, how does the Gospel depict Peter? Well, Peter is mentioned more frequently in the Gospel of Mark than in any of the other synoptic Gospels. Peter gets mentioned, the count I read was, I believe me, I didn't do this myself, the count I read was that he's mentioned about once every 450 words in the Gospel of Mark. Now that compares to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, where he's mentioned about once out of every 750 words. So it's not quite twice as much, but there's a significant, Peter gets a lot more press in the Gospel of Mark than he does in any of the other Gospels. But that press isn't always good. I mean, this is not some glowing account of Peter. In fact, Peter is often described in the Gospel of Mark as foolish or thoughtless. And some of the shining moments in Peter's time with Jesus don't get mentioned. For example, there's no mention in the Gospel of Mark of Peter walking on water. Nothing like that. Matthew talks about it, but Mark doesn't. Mark/Peter is also careful that Peter not become the focus. I think there was an awareness, whether it was Mark writing later alone or whether it was Mark receiving dictation from Peter, there's an awareness that Peter, whose memories are the foundation of this gospel, that those memories not in some way intrude upon Jesus. In other words, as John says, as John the Baptist says, I must become less so that he may become more. There's a principle there. And that principle is that Mark is telling the story. These are Mark's memories, Peter's memories, but Peter/Mark is careful that Peter not somehow steal the light from Jesus. There's also something else interesting about the timing of this gospel. The gospel was written either shortly before or after Peter's death. About 20 years, remember Peter is crucified in Rome, about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Sometime in the 50s, maybe early 60s, Peter is executed by the Romans. This gospel, these memories, are not raw. It's not as if Peter sat down 3 months after Jesus was resurrected and said, I want to write this down while it's still fresh in my mind. I mean, he's telling the stories, he's giving the messages, he's repeating. This isn't something he hasn't thought about. Clearly he has. It's not something he hasn't talked about. Clearly he has. But after 20 plus years of ministry, as a teacher, as a preacher, as a shepherd, Peter's memories are filtered through his pastoral concerns. That's what I mean by not raw. That Peter's had a chance to think about and to chew on those memories. All of us have had pivotal moments in our lives which were dramatic. But years later, as we look back, we don't look back on those events with the same young eyes that we once had. We've had experiences. Hopefully we've grown wiser. And I think that that's true of Peter as well. I think that's also something interesting for us to contemplate as we read this gospel together. We might also wonder how the mature apostle looked on his time with Jesus, those 3 years, decades later, as he looked back, as he remembered. You got to kind of wonder if Peter thought to himself, I know he did. I'm confident that he did. Looked back and said, man, I wish I had said that. Oh, I wish I had paid more attention. I wish I had known. Probably not, but maybe he didn't wish he had known. But, we've all had that experience. And you kind of feel a little empathy here with Peter as he's looking back decades later at his time walking with the Son of God. There's a vividness in Peter's narrative, but there's also a healthy dose of self-criticism and self-awareness that is appropriate and for all of us to wonder and think about. All right. So as I said, this is going to be a short one, but we're going to be, in 2 weeks or so, we'll be addressing chapter 2 of the Gospel of Mark. I encourage you to read ahead and find out what's going to happen. And as you read ahead, I want to tell you that when I get back, we're going to be dealing with 4 questions that pop up in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, and leaking into the early verses of chapter 3. And those 4 questions are, who can forgive sin but God alone? Why does Jesus eat with sinners? Why do the disciples of John the Baptist and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but the disciples of Jesus do not? And why is it, as Jesus' antagonists ask, why is it that you do what is unlawful on the Sabbath? So take some time, read that text, read that chapter a few times over, and ponder those questions, and we'll get back to them in just a couple of weeks. God bless you, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.